Okay. Great. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all well, and thank you for coming out on a kind of a frosty evening there. Hopefully you didn't have too much trouble getting here. We're delighted now to welcome Dr. Harman Murtagh, who is our speaker tonight. Dr. Murtagh is going to be talking about the Irish Jacobite Army, and he'll be focusing on some of the Clare soldiers. Dr. Harman is a former senior lecturer and visiting fellow at the Athlone Institute of Technology, which is now known as the TUS, Technological University of Shannon. He was educated in the Trinity History School and the Law Society of Ireland. He's a former president of the Military History Society of Ireland, whose journal, The Irish Sword, some of you might be familiar with that, he edited for 24 years. He's also served as president of the Group for the Study of Irish Historical Settlement. He's written 4 books, the latest of which is The Irish Jacobite Army, which somebody does have a copy here, which was published by the Four Courts back in 2024. And he's the author of numerous articles and book chapters, together with contributions to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, the Dictionary of Irish Biography, and the Royal Irish Academy's Irish Historic Town Atlas. So quite a CV there anyway. So we're delighted to have you here, Dr. Murtagh, and we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you. When you're as old as I am, it's easy to build up a CV. Well, good evening to you all, and thank you for inviting me to talk about the Irish Jacobite Army here in Ennis. As I last year published a book about it. When I think of archaeology and history in Ennis, I think of the late Jerry O'Connell, I think, yes. And I knew him, and I admired his incredible knowledge of every stone in County Clare. And I was round with him on a couple of tours, and he was a lovely man. So I'd like to, if it's not too presumptuous, to dedicate this little talk to his memory. So the slide here shows reenactors at the Battle of the Boyne Centre, which the government have developed outside Drogheda in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement. For 3 years, from 1689 to 1691, Ireland was the centre of a major war. On one side, was the scene of a major war. On one side was a largely Irish Catholic army, the Jacobite Army, which was mostly newly raised and backed by the power of France. The term Jacobite comes from Jacobus, the Latin version of King James II's name. Ranged against it was a multinational force that included English, Ulster Irish, Dutch, Danes, Germans, and Huguenots, mostly Protestants, although there were some Catholics in the continental contingents. Together, these formed the Williamite Army, named after William of Orange, newly installed, replacing James as King of England, and therefore James's antagonist in Ireland. The war in 1689 was for Ulster in the north, with the Jacobite army eventually driven back by William's Protestant supporters there, although the Jacobites prevented a large Williamite army from penetrating further south that year. In 1690, the war was for Leinster in the east, with William coming in person to defeat James at the Battle of the Boyne, a victory that enabled the Williamites to seize the capital, Dublin, with the rest of Leinster, and also to overrun East Munster to the south. But the Jacobite army regrouped behind the Shannon, the great river very roughly marked with a blue line that runs like a backbone down the centre of Ireland. The western province of Connaught, together with Clare, now became the citadel of Jacobite Ireland, and the army successfully held Limerick and Athlone, the major bridging points against Williamite attacks in the autumn and winter of 1690. In 1691, the battle was for Connaught. The Jacobites rather carelessly lost Athlone at the outset, allowing the Williamite army to cross the mid-Shannon. The decisive battle of the war followed at Aughrim in County Galway. The Jacobite army came close to winning it, but the death of their French general, the Marquis de Saint-Roux, undermined the command structure. The cavalry abandoned the infantry, who were left to be slaughtered in thousands. Resistance continued in Limerick, but with food running out, the army was forced to make terms in the autumn, and the war ended. The war goes by several names: the Jacobite War, the Williamite War, the War of the Kings. But whatever the title, it's the only occasion that Ireland has been a significant theatre of a major European war. It was a major crisis too in Irish history, releasing shockwaves that have yet to entirely subside. The forces involved were immense. In 1690, 63,000 troops were present at the Battle of the Boyne, shown here. It's probably the largest concentration of soldiers ever seen on a battlefield in these North Atlantic islands. 40,000 were engaged at Aughrim in 1691. By comparison, at Marston Moor, numerically the largest battle of the English Civil War, fought in 1644, 42,000 were present. At Culloden, the famous Scottish battle, fought in 1746, less than 20,000, probably a lot less than 20,000, but we'll give them that figure. The forces, in terms of casualties, I can only cite the Reverend George Story, a fair-minded Williamite army chaplain, afterwards Dean of Limerick, who wrote the best contemporary account of the war. And he says, "There have died in that kingdom, of one sort and another, at least 100,000, young and old, besides treble that number that are ruined or undone." He meant financially ruined and undone. So 100,000, my friends. He calculated the deaths of combatants, soldiers, at 26,000, about a quarter of the total casualties. So there was nothing bloodless about the Irish phase of the so-called Glorious Revolution. That's what the Brits call it, because it was bloodless in England, in which William overthrew James's regime in England. Neither was it bloodless in Scotland. A number of factors that are frequently misunderstood converged to bring about this conflict. First, the dynastic quarrel. King James was a Catholic convert. His heir was his daughter Mary, pictured here in the middle, who was married to his Dutch nephew, William of Orange, on the left, the stadtholder or protector of most of the provinces that made up the wealthy Dutch Republic. But William and Mary's expectations of inheriting the English throne appeared dashed by the birth of a son to James in 1688. To salvage the situation, William invaded England with the support of an influential faction there who didn't want a Catholic succession. James's religion and his political ineptitude had undermined his position in England. His opponents had subverted the English army and had offered virtually no resistance to the Dutch invasion force. James and his family fled to France, and William and Mary became joint sovereigns of England. But James had his adherents. Their support for his attempt to recover his thrones was the most obvious cause of the war, but by no means the only one. King Louis XIV of France, pictured over there on the right, ruled the most powerful state in Europe. He's on the left, he's seen welcoming James on his arrival in Flanders, to which he fled after his deposition. Everyone knew that a European war was coming, which would be France versus the rest. William was Louis's inveterate enemy and a key player in the alliance forming against France. Louis had expected England, a growing power, to be at least neutral in the coming war while James was king. William's prime motive in seizing England was to add her resources to the alliance that he had formed and thus tip the scales in its favour. For this very reason, the Glorious Revolution, so called, was a considerable setback for Louis. To counter it, he decided to destabilise William's new regime by sending James to Ireland with the promise of generous military support. The idea was to use Ireland as a springboard from which James could re-establish himself in Britain. Privately, the French didn't think much of James's chances, but they calculated that William would be forced to turn his attention to Ireland to deal with the threat James's presence there posed. And this would distract his attention and his resources from Flanders, where William would otherwise take the offensive against France. Ireland became involved because the Irish Catholics were prepared to support James, their fellow Catholic, in the expectation that they would recover the wealth and influence they had lost to new British settlers in the wars, confiscations, plantations, and religious discrimination of the preceding century. By 1688, the Catholic share of land ownership, the main form of wealth in Ireland, had dropped to only 22%. The Irish Jacobites forced a reversal of the post-Cromwellian land settlement on a reluctant James as the price of their military support. This map shows their position. You see, the only county that they owned more than 50% of the land was the County Galway. The rest of Connacht, so-so. Cork and certain areas in Meath and Carlow and Westmeath and Antrim, because of the Earl of Antrim, between 25 and 50%, and less than 25% in a big swathe of the country, especially in Munster, as we can see. But they actually had quite a good share, although less than 25%, in Kilkenny and Tipperary, in particular there. Ireland had a population of about 2 million people at the time. It's estimated that 3/4 of them were Catholics of either Gaelic or Anglo-Norman ancestry. Old enemies, but now more or less united in the face of common adversity. Their leader was the Irish Catholic Richard Talbot, over there on the right. He was an old friend of James, who had ennobled him as Earl and later Duke of Tyrconnell, given him command of the Irish army, and placed him in charge of the Irish government. Before the war, Tyrconnell fostered a Catholic resurgence. Catholic received public appointments, and in a few years, he transformed the Irish army from being an exclusively Protestant force into a largely Catholic one, with an establishment of 8,500 officers and men. However, in 1688, almost half the army's strength was lost in England in a vain effort to prop up James's ailing regime. James came to Ireland in March 1689. The Irish were soon disillusioned with him. After the Boyne defeat, when he left Ireland, they took greater control of their own affairs, and a split developed between the more nationalist professional army officers led by Patrick Sarsfield, and on the other hand, Tyrconnell, who was nominally the commander of the army, but was very much seen as King James's man and regarded by the military professionals as incompetent as a soldier. The other quarter of the Irish population were new or newish Protestant settlers, comprising English Anglicans and Scottish Presbyterians. The latter, the so-called Ulster Scots, were, and indeed remain, firmly entrenched in Northern Ireland. Alarmed by a threat of a Catholic resurgence, Irish Protestants generally supported William, and the Ulster Protestants provided a number of regiments to his army. On the right, the slide shows Orange men, named after William of Orange, marching through Belfast, as they do annually to commemorate the Williamite victory at the Battle of the Boyne. Their narrative stresses the Williamite successes, Derry, Aughrim, Ennis, Skillen and the Boyne, as the banner on the left shows. But in fact, the Jacobites had their successes too. Dromore, Dundalk, Athlone, Limerick, Ballyneety, and Sarsfield's defence of the Shannon in late 1690. Above all, it was an immense achievement of the Irish army to sustain a war for 3 full years against a better equipped and more professional international army, commanded by generals of European reputation. Contemporaries remarked on how much the Irish hated the English. They were enemies irreconciliables, according to the French. And in particular, there was no love lost between the Ulster Scots and their Gaelic neighbours. The Irish Jacobites could not have sustained their war effort without substantial French support. Over 3 years, this came aboard 8 fleets that carried more than a score of generals to lead the army, civilian officials to organise it, and 250 French regimental officers to furnish military expertise at unit level, together with artillerists, engineers, gunsmiths and other artisans, and substantial supplies of arms and materiel, military supplies. Only 1 fleet was intercepted by the English Navy in a 4-hour battle at Bantry Bay off West Cork in May 1689. It involved over 40 warships, and this is a contemporary depiction of it, but by a Dutch artist who wasn't there. But he did, it shows the ships of the period, and it's intended to depict Bantry Bay. Well, no ships were sunk, but the French had the best of the engagement, which still remains the largest naval battle ever fought in Irish waters. For once, the French Navy was the strongest, but while it maintained communications between France and the south and west of Ireland, it failed to exploit its superiority by disrupting Williamite logistics and communications in either the Irish Sea or the English Channel. In Ireland, at the end of 1688, on learning that James had been deposed, Tyrconnell immediately set about an enormous expansion of his depleted army. There was no shortage of men offering themselves as officers and recruits. Estimates vary, but within months, more than 50,000 were engaged. However, this force proved too large and it had to be cut back. Numbers varied, but in round terms, it's probably safe to think of an effective force of about 30,000 men, of which 20,000 formed the field army and 10,000, more poorly armed, were in garrison. The number of units varied, but they work out at an average of about 45 regiments of infantry, foot soldiers, almost all single battalion units of 13 companies each, and about 17 regiments of cavalry and dragoons, mounted troops. The 2 soldiers on the right are illustrating muskets, which were the main firearms of the period. Much the most common was the matchlock, which is the weapon held by the soldier in the foreground. The soldier in the rear is holding a firelock or flintlock. The difference was in the ignition system. The charge in the breech was ignited by a flaming match in the matchlock, and you can see the musketeer blowing on his match to get it to flame so it will ignite the powder. whereas a spark generated by metal striking flint was the method of ignition in the flintlock or firelock. Whichever, the effective range was about 100 meters. After that, if a musket ball hit you, it was like being hit by a stone, you know, it lost velocity. An army of 30,000 required an establishment of 2,500 officers. I estimate that over 3 years, about 4,000 officers served in all. For the 1690 campaign, it was supplemented by 6 French infantry battalions, about 6,000 men, 2 brigades. The army had a small field artillery train, largely French, together with engineers, artisans, and commissaries, also mostly French. The field army would have been accompanied by 10,000 horses and other livestock. Imagine that coming into your parish. The logistical challenge was immense. Soldiers and livestock had to be fed, and the soldiers were accompanied in many cases by their wives and children, who also had to be fed and accommodated. To give you an idea, when the Irish army arrived in France after the war, the French officials were nonplussed by the numbers of their accompanying dependents. Monsieur Bourdal, the commissaire at Brest, complained of the number of women and children, girls and servants. There are officers' families, he wrote, of 10 and 12, and ordinary soldiers come with their wives and 4 or 5 children. His concern was whether he could spend the French government's money to feed them, and that's why he was writing up to Versailles to say, what am I to do about this? The Irish army had enormous problems to overcome. The lack of weapons and material was largely met by France. Over 3 years, Louis sent a 12-gun artillery train, 25,000 muskets, carbines and pistols, 27,000 sabres and swords, 12,000 pike heads, 27,000 grenades, and large quantities of such items as powder, match, belts, spontoons, bandoliers, sickles, panniers, and saddles. And in 1691, 20,000 uniform coats, together with food, brandy, and wine. It sounds a lot, but it was spread over 3 years, and in real terms, it met the army's needs for just about 1. Horses, uniforms, food, and some weapons and materiel were also sourced locally. An officer's commission was potentially a valuable commodity. In return for theirs, in the expanded army, the new officers were expected to subsist their units at their own expense for the first 6 months. This was more than most of them could afford to do, and the consequence was widespread crime and disorder as the hungry soldiers seized whatever was to hand, especially from the new Protestant landowners. The solution was to pay the soldiers, but lacking either the money or the fiscal resources to do this, the Jacobite government hit on the idea of minting as pay in Dublin and Limerick base metal tokens of copper and brass, the so-called gun money, which traders were forced to accept. This picture shows one of the tokens minted in Dublin, enlarged, of course. It displays an image of James on the obverse side here, Jacobus II, Dei Gratia, by the grace of God, King, etc. And on the reverse, his claim to be King of England, Scotland, and rather tactlessly, France. It was an old claim of the English kings, and the French ambassador in Dublin tactfully didn't notice this insult to King Louis. The reverse side also tells us that the coin was minted on the 30th of September 1689. This was because the redemption of the tokens for cash was intended to be chronological. Gun money enjoys a bad press, but the evidence is that it worked quite well until the Jacobite defeat at the Boyne in 1690 undermined its credibility. By the end of the war, it was valueless. And of course, the Jacobite defeat meant that the tokens were never redeemed. However, all good things come to those who wait. Today, 300 years later, you'd pay €200 or more for a gun money shilling in good condition. That's an infantry captain pictured on the left, and he's holding the symbol of an officer, which was a short pike called a spontoon, an espontoon. So that's what he's doing there. And on the right is an original officer's commission. You can just see the seal on top, but anyway. Catholics in Britain and Ireland had been kept out of military life for a generation. Most of the officers and all the private soldiers of the Irish Jacobite army lacked military experience or skills. To some extent, the deficit was made up by Irish men who had soldiered abroad, by Irish Catholic officers who followed James, by British Catholic officers who followed James to Ireland, and of course by the regimental officers sent from France. In all, these experienced officers numbered about 400, or 10% of the total. Most of the rest had never seen military service. And the French officers and infantry battalions were withdrawn after the Battle of the Boyne. Tyrconnell chose the regimental colonels, who were mainly wealthy Jacobite supporters, including 27 peers, Lord this and Lord that. They in turn nominated the junior officers. As the war progressed, more professional soldiers were promoted to the command of regiments. All, of course, nominally held their commissions from King James. The rank and file were volunteers, drawn from the farming, artisan, and labouring classes. Most were from rural backgrounds, as Irish towns, apart from Dublin, were small. Lord Clare told his son to take what serviceable men he could from the prisons. Imagine men in prison in County Clare in those days. The officers drew on their residue of seigneurial influence, and the Catholic clergy were naturally enthusiastic Jacobites and influential supporters of recruitment. The priests also contributed to the maintenance of army morale. But there was undoubtedly great popular enthusiasm for the cause. The censorious English Jacobite, he served as a lieutenant here in the army, John Stevens, expressed his admiration for the ordinary soldiers' fortitude and their propensity to the end to endure hardship, starvation, and worthless pay without complaint. The French who came to Ireland formed a low opinion of the army officers, but they admired the physique and military disposition of their men, whom they considered would make excellent soldiers if trained and properly led. We've lost a bit. Yes. Family ties were strong at all levels throughout the army. The Oxburgh brothers from Offaly are an example. All fought at the decisive and bloody Battle of Aughrim. One, probably John, was a cavalry officer, and he's left a valuable account of the battle, which has recently come to light. The attrition rate at Aughrim was huge. Of his own family's involvement, John wrote, "The battle was like to finish my family. For my brother Richard, that was a major to the Lord Kilmallock's regiment, that was once Lord Lucan, and Hure, that was lieutenant colonel to my brother Harry, were both killed on the spot, with Harry shot in 3 places, of which he lieth with some hopes of recovery, and myself had 2 horses killed under, and in the retreat I rid through 2 squadrons of the enemy without being examined. So there you are, 4 brothers, 2 killed, 1 badly wounded, Henry badly wounded, and the other brother lucky enough to escape with his life. With Colonel Harry, or Henry, well, he did survive, though being sorely wounded, only to come to a sticky end. In 1715, he took a leadership role in the Jacobite rising in England, for which he was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn in 1715. So that's just an example. I could pick out others. Turning now to Lord Clare's dragoons. Dragoons at the time were mounted infantry who rode around on ponies or small horses, but then dismounted for combat. Although the Jacobite army was generally clothed in red, except now if I jumped a page, I think I might have. Yes, I have, I'm sorry. In Clare, the head of the O'Briens, the 7th Earl of Thomond, was a Protestant, long resident in England. The principal Jacobite family in the county was that of his cousin, Daniel O'Brien, 3rd Viscount Clare. He lived at Carrigaholt Castle, pictured here on the left, which at the time probably had a house attached to it, as well as just being a tower house. The house is now gone. The Viscounts Clare descended from the 2nd Earl of Thomond. At Carrigaholt, he had 30,000 acres of land, but mightn't have been the best land in the world in that part of Clare. And with 16,000 acres devoted to my colts and mares. So he was operating a very extensive stud farm. That was his business over there. Lord Clare, Daniel, had 2 sons, Daniel and Charles, successively 4th and 5th Viscounts Clare. All 3, as we'll see, played a role in the Jacobite army. But just to complete the picture, Daniel had no children, but Charles had 1 son who became the 6th Viscount Clare, and he had a son who became the 7th Viscount Clare, but the 7th Viscount died without any children as a young man. And by then, the Charles O'Brien, the 6th Viscount, had inherited the Earldom of Thomond as well. So the Earldom of Thomond died as well as the Viscountcy of Clare with the death of the 7th Viscount. However, Charles O'Brien also had a daughter called Laura, and her descendants survive in France in the person of the Marquis de Breteuil, and he has a fine chateau not too far from Paris. I'll say a little more about him in a minute. Now, back to this one. The portrait on the left is generally identified as that of Lord Clare's father, the 2nd Viscount, who died in his mid-60s, about 1670. However, based on the sitter's age, wig style, and military bearing, I think that there's an even chance anyway that he is in fact our man, Daniel, the 3rd Viscount. And he raised no less than 3 regiments for the Jacobite army, 2 of infantry and 1 of dragoons, which he and his sons commanded. Well, you can see the regiment of dragoons is number 1. He was the first commander, then his eldest son, Daniel, and then in 1691, it became a cavalry regiment commanded by the 2nd son, Charles. His infantry regiment, again, he was the first commander, but he passed the command on to his eldest son, Daniel. And we'll see about it in a minute. And the 2nd regiment of infantry was commanded by Charles until he took command of the cavalry regiment in 1691. And that stage, there'll be no more O'Briens. The lieutenant colonel, who was an English professional, William Saxby, took over the regiments. So that's that. Now, Clare's Dragoons, which appeared in, yes. Turning now to Clare's Dragoons, the Dragoon Regiment. Dragoons at the time were mounted infantry who rode around on ponies or small horses, but then dismounted for combat. Although the Jacobite army was generally clothed in red, except in 1691 when it wore greyish-white French coats, Clare's was known as the Yellow Dragoons, presumably because they wore coats of that colour. And on the right is depicted a trooper of Clare's Dragoons. Lord Clare's stud probably supplied most, if not all, of their horses. Lord Clare himself, as I said, was the regiment's first colonel, but he soon passed command on to his eldest son, Daniel. Later, when Daniel went to France, as we'll see, a serious rift developed between King James, who wanted command of the regiment to go to an English officer, and Lord Clare, who did not, and who eventually succeeded in regaining the regiment for himself. Lord Clare had a low opinion of James, writing to the French War Minister Louvois after the Boyne defeat that James would be better to spend the rest of his days praying to God in a cloister than thinking about commanding armies or governing a state. His own view was that Ireland should become a French dependency. Reformed with 6 companies and 360 strong for the 1690 campaign, the regiment fought as cavalry now on the Jacobite right wing at the Battle of the Boyne, where it performed, they were dragoons at the Boyne, where it performed badly against the Williamite crossing at the east end of the battlefield, in what a contemporary called a shameful flight. It was reported to have ridden off without a backward glance, although subsequently it escorted the French artillery from the field. In both 1689-90 and 1690-91, its winter quarters were in County Clare. Lord Clare died towards the end of 1690, and for the 1691 campaign, the regiment was converted from dragoons into a 6-troop cavalry unit under the command of Charles O'Brien, Lord Clare's younger son, and it mustered a strength of 450 other ranks for the final 1691 campaign. It was present at the Battle of Aughrim, after which, because of casualties of desertion, its strength fell to 29 officers and 230 other ranks. It ceased to exist at the end of the war. Which brings us to Thomas Davis's famous ballad of 1860, Clare's Dragoons. I'll just quote 2 verses. When on Ramillier's bloody field the battle French were forced to yield, the victor Saxon backward reeled before the charge of Clare's Dragoons. The brave old Lord, Lord Clare, died near the fight, but for each drop he lost that night, a Saxon cavalier shall bite the dust before Lord Clare's Dragoons. It's true that a Clare regiment existed in France and that it fought at the Battle of Ramillier in 1706, where it was commanded by the 5th Lord Clare, who was indeed mortally wounded in the conflict, though he wasn't very old at the time, only 36. But emphatically, his regiment was not of dragoons, but infantry. Thomas Davis was actually a good historian of the period, but Clare's Dragoons was a bit of poetic license. Clare's infantry isn't half as musical a phrase as Clare's Dragoons. If we look at the officer list of Clare's Dragoons in 1689, what is most striking is how much of a County Clare unit it was. All the names in red are of people I can identify as coming from County Clare. The 3 names in purple, Morris, Fitzgerald, O'Shaughnessy and Burke, are relatives of Lord Clare, although they're from adjoining counties. Katie Quinn and Sylvester Purden, who are somewhere there, are from County Limerick. Furlong and Dean, like their captain, Roger O'Shaughnessy, are from Galway. Phillips and Frayne, You see the Lieutenant Colonel Phillips and Frayne the Major. These are two professional soldiers brought in to give the unit military expertise. Now, I can't identify the whereabouts of many of the guys whose names are in black, if not all of them, but some of them may come from County Clare as well, like Thomas Clancy, sounds as though he might. Others are from neighbouring counties. Nicholas Archdeacon might be from Limerick and so on. I'm just not sure. But you can see from the sea of red, and allowing that some of the blacks might also be red, that it's a very, very local unit. And these officers would have recruited locally, especially the captains, and so they'd have been bringing in Clare people as well, over whom they would have had, seigneurial influence and traditional leadership relationships and that sort of thing. I don't know that Purdon is a common Clare name, usually associated with the Protestant settlement in Clare. But Sylvester Purdon is from County Limerick, but beyond that, I don't know where he ties in to the family, but he must tie into it somewhere. Turning now to the Clare infantry regiments. Here are the three types of soldier that made up an infantry regiment of the period. Musketeers, depicted on the left, pikemen, depicted in the centre, and a grenadier, depicted on the right. Lord Clare, as I said, raised two regiments of infantry. What happened was the original Clare regiment was enormous, 29 companies against a standard 13. The solution was to split the regiment in two. The original regiment under Lord Clare himself, and the second regiment under his younger son, Charles O'Brien, then aged about 19. Again, many of the officers in both were from Clare, with some from Limerick and other nearby counties. Likewise, we may presume the rank and file. However, when the French sent 2 brigades of infantry, 6 battalions, 6,000 men, to Ireland for the 1690 campaign, Louvois, the great French war minister, who disapproved of the Irish venture altogether, insisted that their number be made up in France by the transfer there of an equivalent number of Irish soldiers. One of the 5 regiments chosen to go to France was Lord Clare's, but under the command of his eldest son, Daniel, who up to then had commanded the O'Brien Dragoon Regiment. In fact, there was some debate about this, which the soldiers themselves resolved by declaring that they wouldn't go under the command of anyone but an O'Brien. So, in April 1690, Daniel sailed with 70 officers and 1,365 other ranks for France. On arrival in France, the Irish were formed into 3 regiments of infantry, compacted down. And these were incorporated into the French army to lay the foundation of the famous Irish Brigade. Daniel O'Brien, who succeeded to the Clare title later in 1690, retained only nominal command of the regiment in France because he was considered too inexperienced for actual command, so that the de facto commander was Andrew Lee, an experienced Irish officer who had long been in the French service, and he was followed by another veteran, Mark Talbot. Meanwhile, Daniel himself was killed at the Battle of Marsegaglia in Italy in 1693. Today is not the time to tell the story of the French and Spanish 18th century Irish brigades, the Wild Geese, as they're called. But it's worth reminding ourselves that they were the direct descendants of the Irish Jacobite army, and they formed a respected military force that was long associated with the exiled Stuarts and their attempts to recover their lost crowns, and whose possible return was the cause of much anxiety to the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland in the first half of the 18th century. Of the Clare Regiment, we can say it had a distinguished record of service in France. Here they are, advancing at the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745. And note, they are wearing the red Jacobite army uniforms they would have worn in Ireland. And they carry the Stuart emblem on their colours. The motto of Constantine, in hoc signo vinces, the Irish harp, and the 4 crowns, England, Scotland, Ireland, and France. Funny thing to be carrying, but anyway, there he is. After the last Lord Clare's death, the regiment merged with the Franco-Irish Regiment of Berwick in the reorganisation of 1775. Following the Revolution, it became the 88th Regiment of the Line in 1791, and it lasted until 1924, when it was finally disbanded. After the war in Ireland, Charles O'Brien, the 5th, he went to France, and he became the 5th Viscount Clare on his brother's death in 1693. And he succeeded to the full command of the Clare Regiment in 1696. So he's depicted here on the left. And he was killed, as we saw, at the Battle of Ramillies in 1706. Over on the right is his son, also Charles O'Brien, the 6th Viscount Clare, making a rare visit to his home county tonight. It's the second time his image has been seen in County Clare ever. He was the most distinguished of all the Irish wild geese, not only commanding the Clare Regiment, but rising to the exalted rank of Marshal of France. The 2 portraits of the 5th and 6th Viscounts are in the collection of the Marquis de Breteuil at his chateau in France. And he, as we saw, descends from Laura O'Brien, the daughter of the 5th Viscount. One unit of the modern French army traces its origins back through the wild geese to the Irish Foot Guards, the senior regiment in the Irish Jacobite army, dating from 1662, which went to France in 1691. It's the 92nd Infantry Regiment, based at Clermont-Ferrand, which provides the mechanized infantry component of the French 2nd Armoured Brigade. On the left, you can see them in their combat role, and on the right, parading with the 18th century colours of the regiment, the Cross of St. George and the Stuart crown on a white background. So they're very proud of their tradition, and they still commemorate it. In fact, they have they wear now Glengarry caps, you know, sort of Scottish, all right, but vaguely Celtic anyway. And they carry the Stuart coat of arms on the regimental cap badge. Well, there was also an expedition to Scotland, and the Irish were present, the regiment, at the Battle of Killucranky, which the Jacobites won in 1689. But look, in the interest of time, we'll move on. We won't stay too long in Scotland. The Irish Jacobite army was not a rabble, but a properly organised, if inexperienced, military force. It began badly in 1689, had improved by 1690, and by 1691, it fought well, despite being finally defeated. On the battlefield, in accordance with the convention of the time, how do I get the light to work? Do I press? What do I press? Maybe it doesn't work. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
Don't use those.
No. Well, anyway, this is a contemporary. The way the army lined up was they put the infantry in 2 lines in the centre and the cavalry in 2 lines on either wing, and then the dragoons deployed beyond the cavalry in a rather irregular way, and also in front of the army, engaging the enemy as they approached. Now, the infantry lined up in 2 lines, but you see the 2 lines there, and sorry, I'll stand to one side. See the 2 lines here, and then each battalion, and they're in a checkerboard formation, so that if you came in the middle here attacking, you met the battalion immediately behind. And if you got through all that, you had to face the second line. Cavalry and cavalry over on the wings. And the idea was that if the enemy cavalry attacked, they would try and drive our cavalry back and then outflank the infantry and roll up the line. On the other hand, if you held the enemy cavalry off and drove them back, you might be in a position to outflank their infantry and roll up their line. And it was cavalry flanking movements by the Williamites that won them both the Battle of the Boyne and the Battle of Aughrim. Even though they admitted or knew that the Irish cavalry were very good and they performed very well at the Boyne, and the Williamites held them in great respect, but not good enough on the day, especially at Aughrim. And here you have, this shows you a dragoon and the sort of cavalryman over there on the right. And the battalions drew up like this with the officers in front to begin with, but once the battle started, they merged in with the soldiers. And you have your musketeers and you have your pikemen. And there on the flanks, you had your grenadier company, one grenadier company per battalion, on either divided between the two flanks or on one flank. You can see a postage stamp size grenadier down there at the bottom. And the main fighting was done by the infantry battalions coming, the opposing ones coming to within about 60 meters of each other and then blazing away. And the guys that could best withstand the fire would win the engagement. If the enemy cavalry came in to attack, then the pikemen came forward, lowered their pikes to within about 30 degrees of the ground, and were like a hedgehog, you know. They kept off the attacking cavalry. The musketeers could keep up a fairly continuous volley. They deployed in 5 or 6 ranks, and the front rank fired a volley, they knelt down and reloaded. This is the French method, which is almost certainly what the Jacobites' army deployed. The second rank then fired, knelt down and reloaded, and so on till you got to the 5th or 6th rank, and by the time they fired, the first rank should have reloaded, and they stood up and fired again. So you were able to keep up a continuous rolling fire, in theory anyway. There was another method used whereby when the first rank fired, it ran around to the rear and reloaded. And then when the second rank fired, it ran around to the rear and reloaded. It seems to me that that would be a recipe for absolute chaos. And I'm sure that the Irish, we don't know for certain, but I'm sure that the Irish used the French method, which is the one that I have described. Now, firepower was, the infantry sometimes engaged in close physical combat, but mostly not so. And firepower was what determined success or otherwise on the battlefield. And the Williamites had far more firepower at the Boyne, which is why their infantry overcame the Irish infantry. And they were more evenly matched at Aughrim, which is why the Irish infantry did very well. So that's how armies were organised, and it was an international business with some variation, you see, between armies. But basically, the generals knew the form and they knew what to do and how it was done. So that's that. Now let's move on to something else, if I can. The Jacobite army was supported by 3 auxiliary forces. 2 of them were not particularly effective. A county militia, which was supposed to exist in each county, and an auxiliary Gaelic army, 13,000 strong, led by an ex-Spanish officer named Baljarg O'Donnell, which operated in North Connaught. Now, Baljarg's a very interesting character, and I can tell you more about him at the end if there's question time if you want. The 3rd Auxiliary Force, bands of partisans called rapparees, who were often directed by army personnel, was far more effective, and it harassed the Williamite army very successfully, killing stragglers, destroying quarters, disrupting supplies, and rustling horses. Their success as horse thieves enabled the Jacobite cavalry to go into the last year of the war in 1691, more numerous than ever before. The Rapparees usually operated in small groups from bogs or in mountainy areas where they lived with their families in makeshift huts. And largely they're east of the Shannon, in and around the Williamite quarters. Only when the Williamite army moves west do we begin to see some Rapparee activity in Connacht. Rapparee activity generated the customary atrocities of partisan warfare, which both sides exhibited. Captured Rapparees, for example, were usually hanged without ceremony, and their severed heads and other body parts put on public display pour discourager les autres. On the left is the fine 19th century bronze statue of Sarsfield in Limerick. The Articles, or Treaty of Limerick, ended the war. The people on the right are demonstrating bottles of treaty beer outside the Treaty City Brewery in Limerick. And in that city particularly, its defence and the final treaty remain very strong in popular memory. The Army Barracks in Limerick is named Sarsfield Barracks. And so there's a sense of association between the modern defence forces and the Irish Jacobite Army. On the right is Patrick Sarsfield, the most famous and successful soldier of the war, with film star looks, and he was ennobled by James as Earl of Lucan. One Jacobite officer described him as the darling of the army. He had previously served in France and England. He emerged as the leader of the Irish army officers during the war, and he was the most obdurate in resisting the Williamites, as they well knew. His daring attack on the Williamite siege train at Ballyneety thwarted William's attempt to capture Limerick in 1690. And it's often forgotten that during the winter that followed, he maintained the line of the Shannon against a Williamite winter attack. After the war, Sarsfield led the Irish army to France, where it remained King James's army, as distinct from the 5 regiments that had gone out in 1690. They were incorporated into the French army, but the ones that came out with Sarsfield were King James's army. But they were, paid and deployed by the orders of the King of France. But the appointments were made by James. Sarsfield became a major general in the French army, but he was killed at the Battle of Neerwinden in 1693. It's often called Landen in Irish school books, but it's much more properly called Neerwinden, and it's actually at Neerwinden rather than the village of Landen that Sarsfield was killed, when he was mortally wounded. Marshal Luxembourg, the greatest French general of the period, that's him in the postage stamp down at the bottom, he told King Louis XIV that he particularly noticed the valour and fearlessness of which Sarsfield had given proof in Ireland. He is a very good and a very able officer. So praise from Marshal Luxembourg was praise indeed. I can't resist deviating for a minute to tell you a good story about Marshal Luxembourg. He was the great French leader in the 1690s, and he came up against William of Orange on the continent several times, and he beat him every time. And Luxembourg was a hunchback, little guy, with the hump in his back. And William is reputed to have said on one occasion, "I can't understand how that damn little French hunchback always defeats me." And word of this went to Luxembourg. And Luxembourg put his little hands together and he laughed and he laughed and he said, "How does William know I have a hunchback? He's never seen my back, but I've seen plenty of his." I don't know if it's true, but it's a great story anyway. Sarsfield was mortally wounded. He was brought to a nearby town called Huy in modern Belgium. And he died there in the hospital. And next door to the hospital is a churchyard. And it's thought that he was buried in the churchyard. At Huy, the locals erected a rather nice bronze plaque, very romantic looking, of Sarsfield with his horse galloping over an enemy gun and so on. Alas, that has been stolen since I took the picture by some lousy Huyite, but there you go. And through the efforts of Dr. Luc Goyen, the French consul in Limerick, who is a lecturer in Mary Immaculate College, Sarsfield's body, they've been searching for it in this graveyard at Huy, and he thought he found it. I'm not sure, he was a bit coy about all that, but he has a DNA from a male relative of Sarsfield, and he hopes to be able to match the DNA with somebody that he finds in the cemetery there. And if so, we can no doubt expect a state funeral after 300 and whatever it is years for General Sarsfield in Limerick. So full marks to Dr. Goyen. He's a great guy. The terms of surrender in 1691 seemed generous. They allowed those who wished of the Irish army to go to France. Led by Sarsfield, about 16,000 took this option, where they formed a nominally independent army for King James until 1697. And that was in addition, as I said, to the 3 regiments sent in 1690, which were already in the French army. Alternatively, those still in arms or under the army's protection, that would have included a lot of Clare people, could opt to receive a pardon, go home, and retain their properties, if they had any, provided they swore an oath of allegiance to William and Mary. Many landowners in particular took advantage of this. Because the 3rd Lord Clare had been outlawed and had died during the war, he was not covered by the treaty, and so his Carrigaholt estate was forfeited, leaving his sons with no further financial interest in Ireland. The total amount of Clare land confiscated was 33,400 Irish acres, of which 30,000 acres formed Lord Clare's estate. So apart from Lord Clare, Claremen didn't lose too much. However, officers of his regiments, such as John and Florence McNamara, Christopher and Teig O'Brien, John Fitzgerald and James MacDonald, all took advantage of the surrender terms to secure pardons and retention of their properties. Indeed, MacDonald managed to do quite well out of the war by subsequently becoming a joint purchaser of part of Lord Clare's estate. Altogether, there were 4,000 Irish Jacobites outlawed during the war in the Williamite courts. Now, it was before the war ended, and the Williamite courts didn't function until the war ended in the west of Ireland. So these guys are nearly all outside the west of Ireland, including County Clare. After the Wild Geese went to France, about 1,000 more were outlawed. 1,300 received pardons from the first lot, and in all, 1.6 million acres of Irish land was confiscated. And I took the liberty of Googling to see that's 2.6 million statute acres, and it's about 1 million hectares. So it was a fair loss. Catholic share of land ownership went down from about 22% to about 15%. In general, it can be said that the terms of the Limerick Treaty were more or less honoured in the letter, but certainly not in the spirit. Catholics were supposed to retain the religious privileges they had enjoyed under Charles II, but this proved a valueless guarantee, and they were soon subjected to draconian anti-Catholic laws, such as an act for the better securing of the government by disarming papists, and so on and so forth. That's just one of the acts that I just put up there. They lost further ground to the new Protestant ascendancy, and they were in no position to give any support from Ireland to the Jacobite risings in Scotland in 1715 or 1745, although the continental Irish were involved in both. However, 18th century Gaelic poetry suggests that Jacobitism remained a popular cause amongst the ordinary Irish. A new genre of poetry emerged in the form of the ashling. It was invented by Aegon O'Rahilly, sustained in the 18th century by Sean Clorach MacDonald and Owen Rose Sullivan. Now, their dates go from 1670 to 1784, so the ashling had a long life throughout the 18th century. And the ashling, as you may recall, portrays a dream woman prophesying or even symbolizing the hoped for return of the Catholic Stuarts to revive Catholic fortunes in Ireland. Beyond that, of course, it didn't happen. Beyond that, of course, King James was not restored, and King William, in the centre here, consolidated his position in the three kingdoms, albeit at a considerable cost. But the King of France, seated on the chair over there at Versailles, the King of France was definitely a winner. For a comparatively modest investment, the Irish diversion had successfully disrupted William's continental plans for 3 years. Furthermore, in the process, Louis's military strength was augmented by the bonus of 20,000 Irish soldiers. So that's the end of the war. Finally, could I just mention the book that I wrote, Building on Work Done by My Father, which came out, well, something over a year ago now. And so that's the first volume. And I'm hard at work on the second volume, which is an alphabetical list of the regiments. It's about 100. A short history of each regiment with whatever details of uniform and colours, that colours meaning flags, that I can find out. A list of the officers of each regiment with footnoted, where possible, short biographies of each and portraits where they exist, mainly of the top brass. So the short biographies, footnoted short biographies of each officer. So there's 4,500 names. There's, I'm not sure how, I'm working at the moment, I'm not sure how many footnoted biographies there'll be, but might be something approaching 2,000. So if you want to find out about the Clare regiments and anything I know about them, will be, of the different individual officers, will be available in the second book when it comes out, and the plan is to have it out in 2026 if I don't succumb first. So there you are. That's the Irish Jacobite Army for you. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
That's great. Thank you. Oh, yeah, that's okay. Thank you very much. No,
Well,
okay.
keep it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murtagh. That was very interesting, and certainly the two books for anybody in interest in the Jacobite Army. Before I trip over the word there, it certainly looks to be very, very interesting and something worth getting. Does anybody have any questions?
I'd just like to know why these the Irish soldiers left before the treaty of the Irish soldiers.
Yeah, well, there are two groups. The groups that went in 1690, the 5 regiments that the French converted into 3, including one of the Clare regiments, they went before the end. They went in 1690. Then we have the Battle of Aughrim and all that in 1691 and the Treaty of Limerick, and the rest go then. But they went, there was a sort of process. The deal was in the treaty that the Irish can go to France and the Williamites would provide the shipping to bring them to France. That was the deal. But once the deal was made, the Williamites did their best to discourage as many of Irish going as possible, because they were going to fight them on the continent, so better that they should stay at home, you see. So there was both sides addressed the soldiers, and Sarsfield and company said, come with us. And Wilson and some renegade Jacobites said, no, stay in Ireland. Eventually, it's hard to make out, but eventually about 16,000 seem to have gone. And they were formed. You could imagine that, when they went, their units broke up. But when they got to France, they would have, the units would have come together to some extent, and then been united with others to form these regiments in King James's little army. So although it's hard to trace the continuity of unit identity for the lot that went in 1691, you can take it that to an extent it was probably there. And there's a list of how many went from, well, for many regiments, there's a list of how many soldiers went, for many regiments, not for all.
The wild geese applies to both.
The what?
The term the wild geese would apply to every...
It applied to them all, yes. Okay. It's generally a term, yeah. It was actually used, I think, in quite early on as an expression. I think I say it in the book, but I've forgotten the answer. But I say it in the book the first time it's used. Yes. It's quite early on, yeah. And the image is, wild geese go and then they fly back, and that's the idea, yeah.
Why would James have changed his religion to be Catholic?
Why?
Yeah.
Of course, his mother was a Catholic, and he when he was middle-aged, he had a moment of conversion. I think Catholic religion is right, he thought. And so his brother Charles, King Charles II, who was a magnificent character, a far subtler politician than poor old James. King Charles had one principle, that was, I'm not going on my travels again. I'm going to hold on to my throne in England. And he didn't mind what he did in order to do that. He'd no other principle. But he may have been a secret Catholic, and certainly he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. So it kind of was there. Now, James was a genuine convert when he was middle-aged, about 1670 or so. And it made his position very awkward in England, because Charles had no legitimate children. He had plenty of illegitimate ones, but he had no legitimate children. So James was his heir. And there was trouble in the 1670s about this, but they got over it. And when he ascended the throne, there was no fuss at all, and he promised to respect the Church of England and that sort of thing. But there it was. He was a very convinced Catholic convert. And his son, James, William and Mary, okay, Mary dies, William carries on. He dies 1703, and his sister-in-law, Queen Anne, the younger daughter of James, becomes the queen. And when she dies, she has children, but they're all dead before her. When she dies in 1715, James's son, the infant, could have come back to be King of England if he would change his religion to become an Anglican, but he wouldn't, because I suppose his father's influence and so on, yeah. So that's how he was converted, yeah. It didn't stop him. I hope you don't mind. It's a little unseemly, this story, but I'll say it all the same. You can throw me out if it's offense. Charles, as you know, was a famous womanizer. And he had a lot of illegitimate children. And most of the English dukes to this day are descended from him. Not the Scottish ones, but the English ones, however, other than the royal family. However, that aside, James likewise was a womanizer, and he didn't stop when he converted to Catholicism. And King Charles told rather a good joke, at least I think it's still a good joke once. He said, James, he said, your mistresses must have been imposed upon you because they're so ugly. They must have been imposed upon you as a penance by your confessor. So that was sort of 17th century joke, if you like. He's a splendid character, Charles II. Poor old James is, he was an ex-soldier and an ex-sailor, and he's rather wooden in his attitude to life, but very deeply religious and deeply committed to the Catholic religion once he took it on. His first wife was I'm not sure about her. I think she was officially an Anglican. I have some idea she might have tended towards Catholicism, Anne Hyde, but she died, and the two daughters were brought up as Anglicans and remained very committed Anglicans, Mary and Anne. But then James married again, and there were no children that survived for about 10 years. The next thing, the Prince of Wales arrived in 1688, and he lived to be a ripe old age sometime in the 1760s before he died. But he could have become King of England, but he wouldn't change his religion. No, he wouldn't change.
Interesting. Okay. Any more questions? You have
Yes.
questions, sir?
You listed that there were surgeons associated with the various regiments. What were the medical facilities like?
Well, every regiment had a surgeon. So what was a surgeon? I think he would be, I'm not able to fully answer that question, but I think he would be more like a medical orderly, but he's on the regimental staff as surgeon. I don't know if he actually holds a commission. I haven't got any evidence that he did, but he ranks as an officer or a sort of officer anyway. Now, one or two of the prominent medical people were prominent in the Dublin Society of Surgeons, Barbers and Apothecaries. I forget its exact name. And I mean, that was a very grand organization, but it had all sorts in it. And again, we say something about it in its book, in my book, something about it. But you wouldn't be a very eminent surgeon, military surgeon, if you were just a member of the Guild of Apothecaries or whatever they were called. The French, well, the wounds that you suffered were either bullet wounds. If you're hit by a cannonball, that was the end of you. But a bullet wound or a slash wound from a sword or a thrust wound from a pike. Slash wounds could be cured. A bullet wound, not so easy, because the bullet had to be extracted and the chances of gangrene and so on, or sepsis or some of those things was very high. French officers, for several of them were killed at the Siege of Derry in 1689. Monsieur Foumeron, who was the chief civilian organizer, he was a commissary in France. He was the chief civilian organizer sent to Ireland by Louis, and he did wonders with the army. He was here in 1689 and in 1691. He wasn't here in 1690 because he had to go home, because he had a very troublesome fistula problem. And he was determined that it wouldn't be operated on in Ireland, but that it would be operated on in France. So he sought permission to go home. So that will give, my old tutor, Dr. Sims, once said that another of the French, what was his name? The artillerist, his name won't come to me, but it doesn't matter. He was wounded at Derry. And Dr. Sims said, he declined the services of an Irish army surgeon and so survived. So, the hospital situation was bad. As 1689, there was a terrible field hospital up near Derry. Subsequently, field hospitals down in Meath. The reports on them from people that went to them, inspecting and so on, were terrible. And the French brought their own field hospital in 1690. And there was very little about hospitals in 1691. You were better off not to be wounded because your chances weren't great if you were. But the Williamites had a marching hospital, a field hospital, and they also had a hospital in Dublin for wounded soldiers. The French found when they came to Ireland that they had a lot of deaths from disease, and probably linked to the water. Whereas the Irish were probably pretty immune to whatever bugs were in the water in those days, the French weren't, and they had a lot of sickness and a lot of deaths, and they had to make up the gaps in the regiments by compulsorily recruiting from the Irish army.
What did the
That's-
Grenadiers do?
What?
The Grenadiers that you mentioned.
Yes, the Grenadiers, well, the Grenadiers were mainly used for assaults on cities and towns. And they were called Grenadiers because they were armed with a hand grenade. Now, a hand grenade in those days was a hollow metal ball, like a small cannonball, except it was hollow on the inside. It was packed with powder. You put a fuse in the top. You lit the fuse. You watched it go down till it was getting near the powder, and then you threw it. And it exploded, doing awful things to whoever got it. If you threw it too soon, because you were a bit windy about looking at it, the boys that you threw it at could throw it back, and you were done for. So, and they were usually the biggest soldiers, and they were the ones that went into the breach. If your cannon made a hole in the city wall, a breach, and you attacked to the hole, the Grenadiers led the assault. And they were big. They had hatchets. They had their hand grenades. And the hatchets were to cut away any, they had fascines, which are bundles of twigs, the equivalent of modern barbed wire, I suppose, to cut those away and drive in. And so that was their job. Very hazardous. Imagine this ball with the fuse, and your mate beside you has one too. And so, if he holds on to it too long, not only will he do for himself, but he'll do for you too.
They didn't take part in the battle.
They did. There was one company of grenadiers with each regiment, 12 companies of pikemen and musketeers mixed, and then one separate company of grenadiers. And they were seen as the prestige group in the regiment, and they took up position on the battlefield on the edges of the infantry regiment. That's where they went. I'm not sure if they had a particular function in field battle that way, but their idea of the grenades was mainly for siege warfare.
That's great. Now, I think we're going to have to, you'll have to get the book. We're going to have to go now because we're supposed to be out here. Yes. But I don't know, maybe the Ennis bookshop has copies, or what, do you know, Declan, who has copies?
If I could say so, the best place to get them is from the publisher, Four Courts Press.
Four Courts Press.
Cheaper
Okay.
than anybody.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. Now, it's excellent. Thank you very much for coming and speaking to us.
Delighted.
So we have our book launch in 2 weeks' time on the 4th of December. That is in the Ennis Parish Centre, and that's the launch of the Clare Road book. That's on at there's a mass on at 7:30 in the cathedral, and then at 8:15 in the parish center. You can come in for the book launch. And then our next meeting will take place on the 15th of January here, 2026. Okay? Thank you very much for coming, everyone. Thanks. Thanks a million.